Okay, we're reading Spiritual Eyes, book Kenney. We're reading chapters 15 and 16. Chapter 15 is called The Aftermath. Sam's just been fired by Principal Jacobs, and now we're coming into whatever happens after that. Thursday morning, Nicole Grump enters the school building to teach not hers, but Sam's third grade class. She's all prayed up, giving her an advantage over everyone else. God blesses this classroom and all who enter it. God bless this classroom and all who enter it today and every day, prays Nicole, unlocking the classroom and stepping in. The room is a normal third grade classroom, except for a huge half finished wigwam literally filling the whole space. This wigwam has been outlawed by Principal Jacobs, but it still stands several feet above any of the third graders, unfinished and huge. Good morning, Miss Grump, greets Mary, another third grade teacher, passing by to her own class. Really sad what happened to Mr. Waycross. Hope you have a good day. Thank you, Mary, smiles Nicole as she goes about straightening up the room in preparation for teaching a class of disappointed students. Good morning, Miss Grump, greets an upbeat Principal Jacobs. No questions, please. I just want to be sure you're here where you're supposed to be. I wish you a great day. But what am I supposed to do about the wigwam that is taking up our whole classroom? Asked Nicole, smiling. Miss Grump, I said no questions, reminds Mr. Principal. Reminds Principal Jacobs. That is a question. We will resolve it with the new teacher when she arrives next week. So, not your problem. Have a great day. As Principal Jacobs leaves, in walks Alex, looking very sad. Good morning, Alex, cheers Miss Grump. This is the day that the Lord has made. Let us enjoy it to the full. I'm not sure what that means, Miss Grump, but good morning to you, greets Mrs. O'Brien, Alex's mother, who is entering the classroom right behind him. Good morning, Mrs. O'Brien, greets Miss Grump, smiling while shaking her hand. We are so happy to see you here today. Is there something in particular that you need from me? I would like to know what happened to Mr. Waycross, for starters, replies Alex's mother. Well, he was fired from his job as a teacher here by our principal Jacobs, answers Miss Grump. Do you know the reason for his hiring by chance? Asks Mrs. O'Brien. It all stemmed from the Wigwam project, states Miss Grump. Some of the parents were complaining that no real learning was occurring while the students were all focusing on the Wigwam. It certainly seems absurd to us, says Mrs. O'Brien. We received no notice that this firing was pending. You're right about that, Mrs. O'Brien, agrees Miss Grump. We were moving along just fine Monday and Tuesday. Everything was going just fine. Then, right after lunch on Wednesday, he was gone. Very abrupt. And what were the complaints against him? Asks Mrs. O'Brien. Alex didn't seem to know why he was removed as a teacher. Apparently, several of our parents felt that building a small house inside of the classroom was crazy and that it was taking time away from real learning, reports Miss Scum. By learning, I guess, they meant learning using a textbook. Honestly, I've heard nothing about any parents being upset with Mr. Waycross, ponders Mrs. O'Brien. We all like his manner of teaching, and he certainly doesn't take the easy way out. He really seems to work well with his students. You would need to ask Principal Jacobs about this, Mrs. O'Brien, instructs Miss Gump. I just have I have way too little information to help. Well, thanks. I will go see him now, replies Mrs. O'Brien. I'll let you know what I learn. Thank you for that, says Miss Grump. I would very much like to know what happened as well. Mrs. O'Brien says goodbye to Alex after checking out the awesome wigwam which is occupying most of the classroom. I'll be back, Miss Grump, says Mrs. O'Brien, heading down the hall towards the principal's office. After being received at the main office and then ushered into the principal's office, Mrs. O'Brien finds herself sitting in front of a huge desk, which makes her feel a little bit like a kid. Good morning, Mrs. O'Brien. How are you this fine day? Greets Principal Jacobs, just entering the office. I'm good, Principal Jacobs, but I also am a little confused, responds Mrs. O'Brien. Okay, confused about what, please? Asks Principal Jacobs. My son is in your third grade, specifically Mr. Waycross' third grade class, begins Mrs. O'Brien. Oh, and you're probably wondering why he just up and left. Yes? Smiles Principal Jacobs. I am wondering why he was abruptly fired. Yes, restates Mrs. O'Brien. No, he chose to leave, corrects Principal Jacobs. I think he is trying a new career or something. His leaving is causing some grief, I'll tell you. It's hard to find an available third grade teacher this late in the year, but we will replace him. And you are sure he was not fired, correct? Clarifies Mrs. O'Brien. Alex seemed to think Mr. Waycross was really enjoying his wigwam project, and he made no indication that he was planning to leave. I was caught by surprise too, Mrs. O'Brien. I thought he was enjoying the wigwam project, states Principal Jacobs, right, rising to shake Mrs. O'Brien's hand. Thank you so much for your interest and your concern. I wish you a good day. Heading back to Mrs. Grump's classroom to tell her what she learned from Principal Jacobs, Mrs. O'Brien sees Brett Green, her daughter Sherry's fifth grade teacher. Oh, hi, Mr. Green, calls out Mrs. O'Brien. I'm Sherry's mother. Do you know why Mr. Waycross left the school so abruptly? I'm interested because he is my son's teacher. Well, yes, I remember you, Mrs. O'Brien, and I must say Sherry is doing very well this year, answers Mr. Green. But what do you mean about Mr. Waycross leaving the school? Do you know where he went? Is he in a hospital? No. Miss Grump, who is substituting for him, said he was fired yesterday. But Principal Jacobs says that Mr. Waycross just left to go do something else besides teaching, reports Mrs. O'Brien. I was hoping that you could clarify this for me. The only thing I know for sure is that Sam missed lunch period yesterday, which is unusual for him, says Mr. Green. I know nothing of his leaving the school or being fired. Okay, thank you, Mr. Green, says Mrs. O'Brien, heading on towards Miss Grump's classroom. I will try to learn the truth about this and let you know what I discover, calls out Mr. Green as he walks towards the main office. Thank you, Mr. Green, replies Mrs. O'Brien from down the hall. Mrs. O'Brien is completely surprised by what she sees as she enters Miss Grump's classroom. The kids are all busily working on different parts of the wigwam with Miss Grump videotaping the whole scene. Wow, exclaims Mrs. O'Brien. I thought Principal Jacobs canceled this project. Or am I not supposed to tell you that? Are you just forgetting all of that? Principal Jacobs told me to try to get as much of this done before the weekend, reports Miss Grump. The kids are all glad to hear that, and they dived right back into building Mr. Waycross' wigwam. They are really into this class project. What did you learn from Principal Jacobs? Well, Principal Jacobs told me that Mr. Waycross was not fired, reports Mrs. O'Brien. He apparently just quit to go do some other kind of work. Principal Jacobs was caught completely by surprise. He was having some trouble finding a replacement even for Mr. Waycross on such short notice. We are so lucky to have you available. I'm glad you are here. Wow, whispers Mrs. whispers Miss Grump, working her video camera. What do you mean, wow? What are you seeing? Asked Mrs. O'Brien, searching the wigwam for something amazing. No, I mean your report about what Principal Jacobs said is so different from what I saw yesterday, quietly states Miss Grump, still filming. How do you mean? Asks Mrs. O'Brien. Well, first, right after lunch, Sammy came to the classroom and told me that he had just been fired and had to leave the building right away, begins Miss Grump, still filming. He asked me to stay and watch the kids for him. Just then, in comes Principal Jacobs, instructing me to be the substitute for Sammy's class for the rest of the week. He then told Sammy to get out right now. Sammy was being hugged by a bunch of crying kids, making it hard to leave. You saw all this? Asked Mrs. O'Brien, quickly becoming angry. This all happened right here in this classroom? I'm afraid so, Mrs. O'Brien, says Miss Grump, videotaping the kids finishing up the wigwam exterior. He kicked Sammy out of the building, sent the kids back to work on the wigwam, half of them crying, and told me to teach Sammy's class for the rest of the week. Then he left the classroom. So he just told me a huge lie, sighs Mrs. O'Brien. I can't believe that you have a principal who is so corrupt, so even evil. Is that too harsh? I kind of, I, I, I kind of don't think so, whispers Miss Grump, videotaping the third grade kids of Mr. Waycross' class, celebrating the wigwam's completion. You kids are rock stars, shouts Miss Grump to her class of excited kids. And that's the end of chapter 15. Now we'll start chapter 16. Which is titled Sam Visits His Union Rep. Sam Waycross parks his car in the parking lot of a well-known law firm downtown. He has a meeting scheduled with his teacher's union representative, who is employed by this law firm as well as by the union. Generally speaking, Sam does not do lawyers, doctors, or hospitals, if he can avoid it, but this situation really needs professional help. He takes the elevator to the fourth floor, asking the receptionist there for his union rep, Mr. Brown. He is ushered down a long hallway to a very small, dark meeting room and asked to wait for Mr. Brown. Can I get you some coffee or tea, Mr. Waycross? Asked the young receptionist. Some coffee with cream would be wonderful, thank you, answers Sam, sitting down at the old, gnarled meeting table. The receptionist leaves to get his coffee, leaving Sam to ponder whether engaging with this union rep is such a very good idea. He's always been a team player, never stepping out on his own to do a chancy project like a wigwam project, never going against the principal. Now, with his union rep, he would be going against the system. Still, he had been terminated without process. That shouldn't be allowed. The receptionist brings Sam his coffee, tells him the union rep, Mr. Brown, is with another client but will be here as soon as he can, and she leaves. Again, Sam is alone in his room with his thoughts. Should he have even tried to do the Wigwam project? Should he have incorporated that with regular teaching? He's never spoken with whomever was asking for his firing. Do they know that he doubled up on the normal teaching the week before? Principal Jacobs knew that. An even bigger question pushes its way into Sam's thought was why didn't Nicole's prayers keep him from getting fired? He doesn't believe in all that God stuff, but Nicole sure does. Doesn't God at least listen to Nicole? She's always talking to him. Why did he let all this happen? What is the point? A loud knock comes at the door, bringing Sam out of his thoughts. Quickly entering the room is a wiry, youngish man, dressed more for a walk in the woods than for a meeting in a high-powered legal office. "Good morning, Mr. Waycross," says the young man, shaking Sam's hand. "Good handshake," thinks Sam. "May not be so bad." "Thank you for waiting, Mr. Waycross. We are very busy this week for some reason," explains Mr. Brown. "Must be a full moon or something." "So, Mr. Brown, I'm not really sure uh, that we should even be making waves here in this situation," begins Sam, just saying what he's been thinking. "I probably should be applying for another teaching job instead of trying to get my old employer in trouble." "I appreciate your honesty, Mr. Waycross," politely begins Mr. Brown. "We aren't trying to get your employer in trouble. He can and frankly has done that for himself. But of course, I'm speaking of Principal Jacobs. We've had several cases regarding him, his leadership style, and his integrity. No, this case is about you, your reputation, and your teaching career." "You've had other issues with Jacobs?" asks Sam, now becoming interested. "Yes, and there will be more, I expect, so long as he is in control of the operations of any school anywhere," answers Mr. Brown. "We do need to be very careful in preparing our case. He is willing to say and do whatever he needs to win his case." "Okay, first, how much will this process cost me personally?" asks Sam. "Good question, Mr. Waycross," says Mr. Brown, smiling. "My answer is twofold. First, you pay a set fee of $250. The union picks up all other costs. Second, your reputation as an educator is always on the line in a legal process like this. We need to make sure that Principal Jacobs cannot harm your career as an educator. That is the main issue here, Mr. Waycross." "Okay, well said, Mr. Brown," agrees Sam, impressed with his answer. "So what do we do now?" "I need to get your perspective on the events leading up to your firing yesterday," begins Mr. Brown. "Details, I need lots of details, because the devil is in the details. Cases are won and lost because of details, often seemingly minor details." "So when do we start?" asks Sam, now ready to go on the offense. "Why, now," insists Mr. Brown. "Details fade or are lost with time. You will begin to forget details, or they'll become blurry in your recollection. We need to get them all down on paper now. Write us a check for $250 now. Then go take care of any pressing issues that you have so that we can totally focus on this case. In other words, clear your desk. This is your whole world from now on." "Wow. Okay. I can pay the fee now, but I don't have any pressing issues for the moment," says Sam, getting up to get his checkbook from his briefcase. "Then write your check, give it to the receptionist, and go walk around the building a couple of times," says Mr. Brown. "I'm really serious, Mr. Waycross. Go clear your head, because this is going to get intense." "Okay, I will," chuckles Sam, heading out the door of the little meeting room. "I'm getting the sense that this is very serious now, and all this is happening because I was trying to do the right thing, trying to make learning more objective for my kids, just trying to do a better job. I have found in the few years I've been doing this that at least in teaching, no good deed ever goes unpunished," says Mr. Brown, smiling as he follows Sam down the hall to the receptionist. "What is your first name, Mr. Brown?" asks Sam. "We are going to be working together for a while, so I'd like to call you by your first name. You may call me Sam." "No, sir," replies Mr. Brown emphatically. "We need to show the world that we are professionals, not friends. You call me Mr. Brown, I'll call you Mr. Waycross throughout the case. I'll see you in 30 minutes. And that is the end of chapter 16. Next, we will start with 17 and 18. Thank you for listening.